you can change your habits, you can change your life. Gradually, you can become someone new. With consistency and repetition, you can actually change not only your results, but actually your identity. Is because the more evidence that we have for a belief, the more likely we are to believe it. Everybody wants a transformation, right? Everybody wants a radical improvement, want rapid success, but we fail to realize that small habits and little choices are transforming us every day already. For the rest of this talk, there are 4 stages of habit formation. I'm going to take you through each of those 4. So the 4 stages are noticing, wanting, doing, and liking. Noticing, wanting, doing, and liking. Many people think that they lack motivation when what they really lack is clarity. They think that they need to get more motivated, that they need willpower in order to execute on a habit. If I just felt like writing, if I just felt like meditating, if I felt like working out, then I would do it. But in fact, they don't have a plan for it, and so they wake up each day thinking, I wonder if I'll feel motivated to write today. I wonder if I'll feel motivated to work out today. But instead, you can take the decision making out of it by explicitly stating when, where, and how you want to implement the habit. It sounds easy to say, let's just start a plan, let's write down exactly what you should do, and then maybe you'll follow through on it. But of course, we all know that there are challenges that arise, it's not quite that easy. So here's a little strategy that I like to use to make sure you can come up with a better plan of action. And the goal, whatever the most important thing is that you want to work on. And then I want you to imagine, fast forward 6 months from now and you failed. And then tell the story of why you failed. What happened? What challenges did you encounter? What was it that took you off course? Once you have all that stuff laid out on the table in front of you, you can start to make better choices about how to develop a plan. You can start to have if-then plans. So not only do I want to exercise for 20 minutes on Monday at 5 p.m., but also if I do not exercise because I have to take my kid to practice or whatever, then Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. I will go in, right? You can have ways to adjust for these challenges. Stage 2, wanting. One of the most overlooked drivers of habits and human behavior is our physical environment. And this is an interesting insight about our desires. Your environment often influences them. We want things simply because they are an option. Right? Simply because they are in front of us at the time. Thankfully, you don't have to be the victim of your environment, you can also be the architect of it. You can decide to design something to make your good behaviors easier and your bad behaviors harder. So, when it comes to habits, if you want to practice your guitar more frequently, put it right in the middle of your living room so you run across it all the time. If you want to read more, when you make your bed in the morning, take the book you want to read, put it on top of the pillow, and you come back that night, pick it up, read a few pages, go to sleep. Many of our desires are simply shaped because we have an environment that shapes us in that way. So the moral of the story is I've never seen someone stick to positive habits in a consistent fashion in a negative environment. Maybe you can overpower it once or twice, maybe you can have the willpower to do the right thing on one day, but if you're constantly fighting against those forces, it's going to be very hard to follow through. Stage 3, doing. The important insight here, especially for habits, is that in the beginning, the most important thing is just to shut up and put your reps in. Just make sure that you hone the skill, right? And you can start to think of it, the way that I like to think of it is that any outcome that you wish to achieve is just a point along the spectrum of repetitions. So if you have few reps to more reps, and you can imagine an easy goal, moderate goal, a hard goal, the more reps that you put in, the more likely you are to achieve that goal. Now, what I like to say is you should optimize for the starting line, not the finish line. Right? So often when we think about habits, goals, routines, achievements, it's all about the milestone. We think about how much weight we want to lose, how much money we want to earn, how many subscribers we want to have. It's all fixed on the finish line. But instead, if you can optimize for the starting line and make it as easy as possible to get started and get your reps in, often the outcomes just come as a natural result. Stage 4. Liking. The only reason that we repeat behaviors is because we enjoy them, because we like the reward. If we don't enjoy the experience along the way, we're unlikely to stick with it. And that means that you need to figure out ways to bring a reward into the present moment because good habits have a problem. And that problem is that for good habits, the immediate consequence is there. There's a cost that happens in the moment, but the reward is often delayed. So you need to figure out how to bring the reward into the present moment to stick to a good habit. And someone else who's going to be speaking here, Seth Godin, had a very nice little quote about this, where he said the best way to change long-term behavior is with short-term feedback. And one way to think about that is that Long-term behaviors, sticking with writing for years on end or going to the gym and so on, they have those delayed consequences. So you need a way to enjoy it in the moment. So here's what I think you should do. Get a wall calendar where you can see every day of the year mapped out on it. And then any day that you do your task of writing jokes for 15 minutes, I want you to just put an X on that day. And you'll have a couple false starts here and there, but at some point you're gonna get a little bit of a chain going, right? You get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days in a row. And at that point, your only goal becomes to don't break the chain. Doesn't matter how good or how bad the jokes are, doesn't matter if it makes it into your material, just don't break the chain. What's interesting about this is that by measuring your progress, you get an immediate reward in the moment, right? The reward of like having a great stand-up routine 40 days from now or 40 weeks from now or whatever, is not, it's so delayed that you need something in the moment that makes you feel good. So if you do those 15 minutes, you can cross that off. That's a way to get an immediate hit, a little bit of a reward by tracking it. We often fear that in order to achieve something new, to become someone new, we have to abandon everything that we are. But in fact, that's not how it works. Change can happen plank by plank, board by board, habit by habit. Gradually, you can become someone new. With consistency and repetition, you can actually change not only your results, but actually your identity. Is because the more evidence that we have for a belief, the more likely we are to believe it. So if you go to church every Sunday for 20 years, you believe that you are religious. If you study Spanish every Thursday night for 20 minutes, you believe that you are studious. The actions that you take provide evidence for who you are. And it's not that habits matter more necessarily on an individual basis. Each moment in life matters, but what ends up happening is that over the broad span of time, things that you do once or twice fade away, and things that you do time after time, day after day, week after week, accumulate the bulk of the evidence for what you believe about yourself. And so every action that you take is actually a vote for the type of person that you want to become. If you want to become someone new, then you can take a new action and begin to accumulate evidence for that identity, for that belief about yourself. And that the more votes that you cast, the more likely you are to win the election. You don't need to be unanimous. You don't have to be perfect all the time. You just need to have the body of work. So true change is actually not behavior change. It's not results change. It's not process change. It's identity change. The goal is not to read a book. It's to become a reader. The goal is not to write a book or write an article. It's to become a writer. The goal is not to run a marathon. It's to become a runner, to become a type of person, to develop an identity. And the way to being something or becoming someone is through doing something. So every time you sit down to write, every time you practice that habit, you are being a writer. Every time you play a sport, you're being an athlete. Every time you practice painting or music or whatever, you are being an artist. And habits are not only the method through which we achieve external measures of success, like losing weight or earning more money or meditating and reducing stress. They are also the path through which we achieve internal change and actually become someone new. They're the path through which we forge the identity that we have, the deepest beliefs we have about ourselves, our sense of self. And so if you can change your habits, you can change your life. That small improvements, tiny habits, little choices are not just a cherry on top of our performance, not just like a nice thing to have, but actually can be the key that unlocks significant success. That's an idea that I want us to carry with us as we go through the rest of this presentation. And one way to think about it is just kind of basic math. Like if you just look at the numbers, if you were able to improve by 1% each day for an entire year, and those gains compound, you would end up 37 times better at the end of the year. And if you were to get 1% worse, you would whittle yourself almost all the way down to zero. And what's interesting here is that everybody wants a transformation, right? Everybody wants a radical improvement, want rapid success, but we fail to realize that small habits and little choices are transforming us every day already. That these times when you make a choice that's slightly better, slightly worse, a little mistake or a small error, 1% better or 1% worse, that these things compound over time. And habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. And so if you can learn to master those, then you can make time work for you rather than get against you, right? Good habits make time your ally. Bad habits make time your enemy. And so throughout the rest of this presentation, I want to talk about how we can do that. Today, I'm going to teach you how to build the habits that you need to get the results that you want. But to do that, or before we jump into the science of how habits work and the science of how we can change our behavior, I want to talk a little bit about self-judgment. And the reason I want to talk about it is because self-judgment is one of the things that can hold us back from growth, one of the most common things that can hold us back from growth. So we have a basketball crowd. Let's say you're shooting. You shoot a free throw and you miss, and the first thing you think is, oh, that's a bad shot, right? You start judging the shot. It's not necessarily a good thing because you're preventing yourself from learning from the experience because you're so in your head judging the experience, right? You're too busy assessing whether or not it's good or bad. And I'll be vulnerable. When I first met Brene Brown, who's great, if you are not familiar with her work, she said, your experience here today will only be as great as your willingness to be vulnerable. And I would say we could say that about this experience as well, right? The willingness to be vulnerable that you have for this whole thing is going to determine how much you're going to get out of it. And so I'll share a little bit. How awesome was... When he got done, I was like, man, I am not going to be like that on stage. And I felt bad about that for a little bit. And so what I was doing there is what you do when you judge yourself after you miss a shot. I was practicing this self-judgment, right? I was getting in the way of my ability to do the work and share my own message because I was too busy criticizing myself. Instead, I would like us today to think more about being like a rose bush, being a seed, right? When you plant a seed, you don't criticize it for being small, for being rootless and stemless, and then it sprouts out of the ground, it's a little bud. You don't criticize it for not being a bush yet or not being fully grown. But at each step along the way, it's exactly what it needs to be. And the reason that this is important is because we often judge ourselves, right, based on where we're at. I'm not there yet. I'm not a good enough free throw shooter. I'm not a good enough speaker. I'm not good enough in my business. I'm not good enough at relationships, whatever it happens to be. And we're so busy judging ourselves. And this is actually enforced by the way that society treats a lot of things, right? It's like you're never supposed to be satisfied. You're never supposed to be done. You need to be driven. And we often associate being driven and being dissatisfied as being the same thing. I don't think that has to be the case though, because if you take the rose seed, if you take the bush, it never stops growing because that's just what it does, it grows. And so I would like us to take that philosophy into this next hour where we don't judge ourselves for where we're at. We're perfect whatever stage of our growth we happen to be in, but we never stop growing because that's just what we do. We're like the seed, right? That's just who we are. So, in order to start this off, I want to talk a little bit about Team Sky. I met a couple people from the UK last night who are probably familiar with this story. In the mid-2000s, Team Sky is Great Britain's professional cycling team. And they hired a man named Dave Brailsford. And at the time, they had a pretty middle-of-the-road record when it comes to performance on the world cycling stage. They had never won a Tour de France. And they brought Brailsford in, they said, we want to change that. What's your strategy? What's your plan? And Brailsford believed in this concept that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. The way that he described it was the 1% improvement in nearly everything that you do. So they started by making 1% improvements in a lot of areas you would expect a cycling team to make. They got slightly lighter tires for the bike. They built a more ergonomic seat. They had their outdoor riders wear indoor racing suits. which were lighter and more aerodynamic. They had their riders wear biofeedback sensors so they could see how each person responded to the type of training that they were doing. But then they did a bunch of things that you wouldn't expect a cycling team to do. They taught their team how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infection. They figured out the type of pillow that led to the best night's sleep and then brought it on the road with them to hotels. They split tested different massage gels to see which one led to the best muscle recovery. And Brailsford said, all right, if we can execute on this strategy, if we can aggregate all these tiny little 1% changes, then I think that we can win a Tour de France in about 5 years. He ended up being wrong. They won the Tour de France in 3 years, and then they repeated again in the 4th year with a different rider. And when Brailsford coached the Great Britain cycling team at the Olympics in London in 2012, they won 70% of the gold medals available. And so this idea is central to what we're going to be talking about today. This idea that 1% gains and getting 1% better each day actually is not just a tiny improvement, but adds up to something very significant over the long run. And it's just basic math. If you look at getting 1% better for 365 days in a row, you end up 37 times better by the end of the year. Meanwhile, if you make a slightly worse choice, a tiny mistake, a little error, a small lapse in judgment, and make a 1% worse decision each day, you almost whittle yourself all the way down to 0. And this narrow gap between 1% better and 1% worse, this is the stuff that ends up adding up and making us either champions or standing in second place or not even in the conversation at all, right? Now, getting better every single day is not reasonable, even for the most consistent and most dedicated of us in the crowd. However, if you want to get 10 times better at something, you just need to get 1% better for 232 days out of the year. So that's 5 days a week, 46 weeks a year. That leaves you 6 days for holidays, vacation, being lazy, making excuses, whatever it happens to be, right? But if you get better for those 46 weeks a year, those 5 days a week, you can take weekends off. And if you make 1% improvements, you're going to end up 10 times better by the end of the year than you would have been the year before. Now, so the key idea here is that small habits and tiny gains actually add up to something very significant in a surprisingly short period of time, right? They can multiply into meaningful results very quickly. If we believe this, if we're going to buy into this, then the next question is, how do we do that? Right? How do we execute on that? And that's what the practical part, the next phase of this presentation is going to be about. We're going to answer 3 questions. So first, why do some habits stick and others fail? What's the deal? How do habits work? How can we get into our own psychology? Why are we able to build some behaviors and not build others? Second, how do I know what to change? If I buy into this idea that 1% improvements make a difference, then how do I pick? Right there, we can spend our ways, our attention, and our energy in an infinite number of ways. How do I decide what to focus on? And third, how do I get started and take action? And if you know these 3 things, if you know why and how habits work, if you know what you're going to try to change, and you know how to take action, I don't know what more you could want from a bald man on a Saturday morning. Right? All right, so part 1, why some habits stick and others fail. I like to start by talking about a research study, and this, for those of you who aren't familiar with my work or haven't read a lot of my articles, the typical flow and the flow of this talk as well is going to be some kind of story. We're going to back it up with scientific study or research. I try to base the majority of what I talk about in some type of proven academic study, and then distill it down to a practical insight, something you can take home and actually use. And so that's going to be the flow, and we're just going to repeat that time after time as we go through this presentation. This particular study came from Princeton University, and most people are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan stopping along the side of the road to help a fallen person, help someone in need. Well, Princeton, their theology school, decided to run this experiment. They brought in a bunch of theology students. They said, all right, we're all familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. We're going to break you up into groups, and you're going to go teach in different rooms across campus. You're going to teach this story. And so they started talking about, how they were going to deliver the presentation and so on. And they had a couple different cohorts. The one cohort, they said, all right, just go ahead and go off and deliver the presentation. So they went off to their rooms. The second one, though, they did something interesting. They sent the group off, but on their way to they sent the group off and they said, by the way, we're running a little bit behind, right? You don't have very long to get there. It takes about 10 minutes. You only got 5, so we kind of need to hurry. You're probably already going to be late. So they're in a rush. They know they're going to go give this presentation. on the way, they planted an actor on the campus. And this actor is laying on the ground, hurt, moaning in pain. And so they scream twice, and then they cry out. And every single group went right past the person in need to go give a presentation about helping a person in need. The one person even stepped over the guy who was in pain in order to get there. Now, the point of this, and what I'd like to start talking about now, is the danger of being goal-focused and goal-oriented. These people had a goal, right, to deliver a presentation. And they were so one-sided, so narrow-minded, so focused on that goal that they missed the bigger picture and the perspective of what they should have been doing in the first place. And I think that this can be a danger of goals often. And so instead, I would like to encourage us to focus on systems rather than goals. Here are some examples. If you're a coach, your goal is to win a championship, but your system is what your team does at practice each day. If you're a writer, your goal might be to write a book, maybe even write a best-selling book, but your system is how you write each week, the schedule that you follow. If you're an entrepreneur, your goal could be to build $1 million business or a $10 million business, but the system is the sales and marketing process that you have. The systems are what actually make the difference. They're what drive the results. And what I've seen, having goals is great. Having a vision, having a dream is nice. It's important to know where you're going and where you're headed. It's important to have some clarity of focus, to know that we're moving in this direction. But once you know that, having the goal on paper makes very little difference. And committing to the system and showing up every day drives a lot of results. And so I'd like to talk about how we can build these systems and repeat these habits day after day, week after week. The first thing that I'd like to encourage us to think about is how goals and repetitions actually get you to any outcome that you want. So let's say that you have a goal of squatting 300 pounds, right? Point A might be squatting 100 pounds, and it doesn't take very many repetitions to get there. Maybe you have to be in the gym for, 6 months, a year, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you can do it right now. Point B could be squatting 200 pounds. It's going to take some more repetitions to get there. Point C is much further down the line, take even more. But once you realize this, the only thing that you have to do is put your reps in. The only thing that it comes down to is committing to the system and performing day after day. So habits in this way take you wherever you want to go. All right, how long does it take? This is a common question that people have about building habits. So there was a study done at University College London. They looked at a variety of different habits. On average, they found that it takes 66 days for a new habit to stick, 66 days to build a new habit. This had a really wide range though. Sometimes the habits were very small, like drinking a glass of water at lunch. Sometimes they were much more significant, like going for a run after work each day. The lesson to take away from this is that the range was anywhere from 3 weeks to 8 months. And so if you're looking to build a new habit, if you're looking to install a new behavior in your life, then you can pretty much commit to the fact that this is going to take months, right? This is a lifestyle that we're trying to build. It's not 21 days and then you're done. It's not a 30-day program and then it's like, we did it, habits built, don't need to worry about it anymore. There's some point, which on the vertical axis we have behavior automaticity, so how automatic something is, how little you have to think about it. And then on the horizontal axis, the number of repetitions you need to do. The more reps you do, the more automatic the behavior becomes. And at some point, you get to that little habit line where it tips over and suddenly this is automatic now. So again, we're talking about focusing on the number of repetitions that you do, the system that you build, so that you can make this behavior more automatic and more routine. There are a lot of different habit models, some from the people that I mentioned earlier. Lewin's equation, operant conditioning is a very famous one by B.F. Skinner. Tiny habits model, loop model, hook model, blah, blah, blah. The only reason I list all these here is so that you understand that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about habits, but we're gonna break one down right now, probably the most popular assessment of how habits and behavior work. All of these share things in common, so if you hear people talking about this is the way to build habits, it's a way to think about building habits. All right, here's one way to think about it. I call this the 3 R's. This is very similar to what's mentioned in Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, which is a good book to read if you'd like a little overview. The basic idea is that there are 3 phases of building any new routine into your life. First, there's the reminder, okay? And the reminder is the thing that triggers the habit, the thing that initiates the behavior. It's a cue. So for example, if my phone rings, that could be a reminder. The second piece is the reward, or is the routine itself, the actual habit, right? The action that you're performing. So phone rings, that's a reminder. I answer the phone, that's the routine. The third piece is the reward. And this is the benefit that you get for doing the behavior. Now, when we're trying to build new habits, when we're trying to think about how to initiate these things into our life, the important pieces to focus on are the reminder and the reward. Because if you can figure out how to give the right incentive, the right benefit for doing the behavior, it becomes more easy for it to be ingrained. And if you can figure out how to trigger the behavior, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that may be the most powerful way to initiate new behaviors and habits. I'm going to give you multiple examples of that in a moment. So, let's talk about practical ways to build these new habits. First, simplicity. Start incredibly small. The reason that we want to start incredibly small is that there is some type of friction in the beginning. And the bigger the habit is, the bigger the friction is to start that behavior. So if you were going to break it down in 3 simple steps, and this comes from the Tiny Habits program by BJ Fogg, which is free if you'd like to take it if you really want to geek out on this stuff. tinyhabits.com is where that's at. But start with a habit that's incredibly easy for you. Increase your habit, but in a very small way, and then keep it easy and break the habit down as needed. Sounds super simple, sounds really basic. In practice, it's much harder to do because we often talk ourselves into biting off much more than we can chew, right? Nobody wants to make 3 free throws today, they want to shoot 300. But if you can start with 3 and increase to 4 and then increase to 5, then you can start to build a system of behavior and you focus on building the pattern first rather than focusing on the results. And that's what we're talking about when we say put the system before the goal. So this is a way of thinking about that friction point in the beginning, right? The amount of motivation you need to complete a habit drastically decreases as the habit is completed. Let's say you want to go on a run after work, right? The hardest part is getting your shoes on and getting out the door. Once you do that and you start running, you go the first mile, or might as well run back and finish it, right? Like I'm already halfway here. So the amount of motivation you need at that point is nil. You've already done it, right? The hard part is getting started. And so if you can do multiple things to make this easier. First, you can make the habit smaller, right? That's what we're talking about right now. Let's make the habit as small as possible, reduce the friction needed, so I don't need to rely on motivation and willpower to execute this behavior. The second thing that you can do is design your environment to make it easier to get started. You want to go for a run, lay your shoes and your clothes out the night before. You don't have to make that decision, right? Just reduce the amount of friction points in front of you for performing that behavior. And we'll talk about environment design later. Basically, you want to make it so easy that you can't say no to it. So when you're building a new habit, if it's hard enough that you could possibly not feel motivated, you don't have enough willpower to execute on it, it's too hard, too big in the beginning, right? Make it so easy that you can't say no to start, and then escalate and improve from there. All right, let's talk about habit triggers. Remember, a reminder or a cue is the first piece of the habit routine. It's the first piece of that 3-step loop. Triggers are an incredibly important way to initiate new habits in your athletes and yourself and your coworkers, your spouse, whoever it happens to be. So we have cold triggers and we have hot triggers. Triggers are the cues that prompt behavior. A hot trigger can be acted upon right now. Let's say you're driving down the road and you see a billboard and it says, go visit jamesclear.com. You can't do anything at that moment because you're busy driving. That's a cold trigger. Meanwhile, if I send you a text and say, hey, here's a link to my latest article, you can click on it and read right away. That's a hot trigger, something you can do immediately. So often, when we want to build new habits, we ask people to do it by trying to trigger them in a cold way. If you trigger people in a hot way, they can actually do the behavior right then, rather than having to remember to perform it later. So this is BJ Fogg's, this is how he summarizes building habits. He says this is all you need. Put hot triggers in the path of motivated people. If you can do that, then you can build new behaviors. You get the right group in the room who's motivated to perform an action, and then you ask them to perform a habit that they have the ability to do right then. There are 5 types of triggers, okay? I'll give you an example for each. First, time. So my writing routine, I publish a new article every Monday and Thursday. It doesn't matter how good or how bad I feel about the article. It doesn't matter if I think it's going to make it into a book someday. It doesn't matter if people like it or if they don't like it. It doesn't matter if it's 5 words or 500 words or 5,000 words. It gets published on Monday and Thursday. Time is the trigger. That's the thing that drives the habit. That's the thing that drives the behavior. Location. When I go to the gym each week, I get there and I do the same routine. I set my gym bag down, I take my lifting shoes out, I put them on, I put on my knee wraps, I put on my wrist wraps, I go get a drink of water, I do 10 squats without the bar, 10 squats with the bar, and then I start my workout. It's the same routine, same habit every single time. And the gym, the location, is what drives that habit. Preceding events. When I sit down to dinner each night, I have a daily gratitude habit where when I sit in the chair, that's the preceding event, I say one thing that I'm grateful for that happened that day. I didn't think this was going to be an important habit when I started it. I've been doing it for 3 years straight now, and it's crazy how that one little thing can reset your entire day, and the cumulative effect of always having something to say that you're grateful for, how big of a role that plays on your day and your psyche and your mindset. Emotional state. This one's a hard one, but we often see it with bad habits, right? You get angry, you get frustrated, you get upset, and the emotional state triggers some kind of response. Manu was talking yesterday, you get frustrated while you're driving, you get distracted, you get busy, and then all of a sudden, you're making choices that you didn't think you would or are hoping you would. I sometimes find this when I'm holding tension in myself. If I feel really tense, if I feel uptight, if I feel stressed, I try to use that emotional state when I'm aware of it as a reason to do my breathing routine. And we've talked about breathing exercises a little bit before. I do a really simple one. It's just breathe in for a count of 3, hold for 1, breathe out for a count of 5, and then I just repeat that for a minute or so. So 3, 4, 5 times. If you do that, and you can do that anywhere, it completely resets the energy that you have. So that breathing routine is great. Other people, this one is fascinating. The people that we surround ourselves with dictate our habits and behavior, even if they're not physically by us. There's a really famous study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they found that if you have a friend, even if they live anywhere within 500 miles of you and they are obese, you are 57% more likely to be obese yourself. You don't even have to be around them, you just have to be associated with them. So this social network and these ties can drastically change the type of triggers, the type of habits that you form, the type of behaviors that you fall into. Here's an exercise that you can use when you go away from here. If you're thinking, all right, how do I make this practical? How do I actually use this in my own life? So you're gonna write 2 columns. You're just gonna do a little T-chart right down the middle of the paper, okay? On the left-hand side, I want you to list all the things that you do each day without fail. So I brush my teeth, I wake up in the morning, I take a shower, I get dressed. There'll be a big batch in the morning when you have your morning routine and all the things that you usually do. There'll be another batch usually either when you get to work or sometime around lunch. I get my car keys, I walk out to my car. You can be as detailed as you want to be. Usually another batch when you come home for dinner, and then bedtime routine and so on. But you're gonna go throughout the whole day and list everything that you just normally do. Then in the second column, you're going to list all the things that happen to you each day without fail. The sun rises, the sun sets, a commercial comes on TV, a song plays on the radio, traffic light turns green, traffic light turns red, all the things that are in your normal day that just are going to happen like clockwork. What you have at this point, once you develop these 2 comprehensive lists, is a list of possible triggers that you can tie a new behavior to. So let's say that you wanted to start meditating, for example, and you saw that on your list, in your morning routine, you have make a cup of coffee. For this new habit, you can stack it on top of the old behavior and use the old behavior as the trigger. So you say, when I make my cup of coffee in the morning, then I'll meditate for 60 seconds. And so you're trying to tie the new behavior to an old behavior. The reason that this is useful neurologically, the line is neurons that fire together, wire together, and so on. You're basically creating an on-ramp to this neural pathway in your brain. You've already got this habit built. You already make coffee every morning. It's already something you can count on. And because of that, let's go ahead and tie this new behavior to that same neural pathway and build it into your brain so that it's stronger and has more likelihood to stick. So select the trigger that best fits the new habit. All right. So that gives us an overview of habits. Now let's jump into the practical, like how do I actually change? How do I get started with all of this? So part 2. The first thing I'd like to talk about is in order to make a change, in order to build these new habits in your life, we first need to start thinking about what's distracting me. This is a concept called the Zeigarnik effect from an awesome researcher with the name of Bulma Zeigarnik. In the 1920s, there's a story about 4 or 5 men walk into a restaurant in Germany. They sit down to have their meal. It's a relatively complicated order. So they tell their order to the waiter, and the waiter just stands there and remembers it all by memory, and then walks off, gets the order right, brings the food back. They're really impressed. They ordered a lot of different things, and he didn't mess up anything, right? It was perfect. So they were talking about his memory. They eat the food, they leave, they finish their meal, and they walk out. One guy realizes about halfway down the street that he forgot his wallet. And so he runs back to the restaurant and goes over to the waiter and says, hey, I'm sorry I forgot my wallet. I don't know if maybe you can help me. And the waiter looks at him and says, who are you? Do I know you? And he was like, you just served our party. We were really impressed by how great your memory was. You remember the whole meal. And the waiter looked at him and said, oh, I only remember each meal until it's served. And what we're talking about here is the Zeigarnik effect, which is the tendency to experience intrusive thoughts or to remember things or to spend our mental energy on things until that objective is completed. So we remember things that are incomplete, that are pursued and left undone. Consider for a second what type of role this can play in your life. If you're someone who does what I would call half work, where you start a project and work on it a little bit and then never end up finishing it, or you're doing a task and then you leave it undone, you look at an email and you leave it unread, you use your inbox as a to-do list, all these different things. These are open loops that you're opening in your brain over and over again. You have all this undone work that is taking up mental energy, that's using up space. You can consider your brain kind of like it's like RAM, right? Like in a computer. You're at 100% and then you start to have to remember things and you drop down to 95, 94, and you're taking yourself down, and all of a sudden on your average day you only have 75% of your power to put toward a task because you're so busy trying to remember all these open loops and things that you are spending energy on. So the curiosity gap is the nagging brain, basically. And if your brain is constantly nagging you, you can't put your energy best toward the next task that you're trying to perform. So here's one exercise if you want to play with this. I've struggled with this myself as well. I'm certainly not perfect in any way with this stuff. And so I forced myself to go through my inbox, and I was only allowed to read an email once. I open it, I read it, I have to respond to it or archive it. It's done. I'm not allowed. It's like a ticking time bomb. So if you want to push yourself with this, go ahead and give that a try for 10 minutes. Just try to respond to as many emails as you can in 10 minutes, and you're not allowed to do anything else except for respond to it or archive it. You aren't allowed to leave the loop open. All right, so if we understand that we have all these open loops in our brain, we have this multitasking, busy, mindset that we're dealing with, these things that we're struggling with. What's the next step that we can take, and how do we understand how this influences our behavior and decision making on a daily basis? There was a popular study done. It was written about in the New York Times not too long ago. They looked at 1,000 parole board judges. And so the criminals would come in, they would be seen by this judge, and then the judge would decide whether or not the criminal was going to be let out on parole. Now, you would think that the thing that would influence whether someone was let out of prison was the crime that they committed and the way that they served their time. But what they found was the thing that had the single biggest impact on whether someone got a favorable parole hearing was the time of day in which they were seen. And the reason that this is true, so this is what the judge's decision making looked like, right? So at the beginning of the day, it started out, you had a 65% chance of getting a favorable hearing being released. Then, as they made more decisions and the day went on, that slowly went down to about 0. Then we have this first dotted line, this is the lunch break. Judges get to take some time off, get something to eat, they come back, boom, spikes right back up to 65%. Then they make more decisions throughout the afternoon, fades back down, they give them another break, and then by the end of the day, it's just, dropping off a cliff and going all the way down to 0. This is what's known as decision fatigue. The more choices that you make, the more things that you force your willpower to be used upon throughout the day, the less you have to spread around to the other tasks. You can think of willpower as like a muscle, right? The more that you have to use it, like I can sit up here and, rep out curls for a little bit, but give me 2 or 3 minutes and all of a sudden I start fading, right? And this idea is very useful when we think about building new habits and putting our energy toward our best work. How can you automate the choices and decisions in your life so that you spend less time working on things that will sap your decision, that will take away your willpower, and put that more towards the events that are worthy of it? The judges here, just to wrap this thought up, so one thing that they realized, this actually was like a safety mechanism. When their willpower faded, they're like, I don't have the willpower to make a good decision at this point, so let me just say no and then make the safe call and keep everybody in prison. So that's why the choices started whittling down. And we often do this in our own lives. When we don't have the willpower to take towards something, we say, I'm paralyzed, I'm just not gonna choose it right now. Another thing, I wasn't gonna tell this story, but since I'm on topic, has anybody seen the picture of the lion tamer who's holding like a chair up? They have like a whip and a chair. Well, the whip is just for show. It's just to make a loud noise and good for the crowd. But the chair is actually the thing that distracts the lion. When you put the chair in front of a lion's face, it sees all 4 legs at one time. And so it freezes it a little bit because it doesn't know which thing to move at first, right? It's like it paralyzes itself. We do the same thing in our own lives. You have 4 different priorities you try to work upon at once. Good luck trying to choose the right one, right? We get paralyzed at that moment because we're focusing on too many things. We're spending our energy and our attention in too many different ways. So, to talk about willpower and decision fatigue, let's think about building a new habit. You basically could say, similar to the judges' choices, it goes like this throughout the day, right? We ebb and flow. We have some peaks, we have some valleys, but your motivation is not the same all the time. If you want to build a new habit, you have two choices. Either you have option A, which is say, all right, I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to try to build a really hard habit. I know this is going to take a lot of energy and effort and willpower. And your only choice there is to stack it at the right time of day, right? Do it first thing in the morning when your motivation and willpower is usually high. Do it when you're well rested. Don't try to do it right before lunch like the judges would, because then you have 0% chance of completing the habit. Or you have option B, which is to go back to what we talked about before. Start with an incredibly small habit, a habit that's so tiny that you don't even need motivation and willpower to complete it. It doesn't matter at what point in the day you are, because you're going to be able to stick to it regardless. So the key idea here is willpower is like a muscle, and like any muscle in the body, willpower can get fatigued. So be careful about how you're using it and when you're asking yourself to do something that requires a lot of willpower to execute on. All right. This comes back to the point about the lion and having too many priorities. This is a quote from a book called Essentialism. I thought it was pretty good, actually. So the word priority came into the English language in the 1400s. Before that, it didn't even exist. And for the next 500 years, it was just priority. It was only in the last century that we started having priorities and making it plural, right? And this idea that we can suddenly go from having one most important thing to 10 most important things is a complete myth that our busy, industrialized, technologically empowered culture has started to embrace for some reason. But you can't change the laws of physics. You can't bend reality, as he says, right? You can only have one most important thing, and the way that we operate and the way that we divide our energy and push our energy around has not changed, even if we're defining it in a different way. So, given that, how do we decide what priorities to focus on? How do we decide what to whittle out and what to cut down? Warren Buffett has a strategy that I find relatively interesting and useful. Buffett is probably the most famous investor of the last 100 years and certainly one of the most successful of all time. And this story comes directly from his personal pilot, Mike Flint, who was telling this story to a friend of mine. So Mike Flint has been Warren Buffett's personal pilot for a while. He's also flown Air Force One. He's flown multiple US presidents. He's an accomplished guy. And he was telling Buffett, hey, Warren, you should really get this new plane. It's pretty sick. I'd like to be able to fly this thing. You should buy this at some point. And he was like, I'd love to be able to fly in this, in the next 5 or 10 years. And apparently Warren looked at Mike Flint and said, if you're still flying for me in 10 years, then I probably have failed you as a boss because you're not growing enough, right? You haven't grown out of this. And if I'm serious about developing you, then we're gonna need to do that. So what I want you to do is sit down and write the top 25 priorities that you have for yourself for the next 10 or 15 years. And this exercise I'm about to share, you can do this on any timeline, right? You can do 25 priorities for your career, you can do 25 for this month, 25 for this year, whatever works for you. So Mike Flint goes off, writes down his 25 priorities. He comes back and takes a look at Warren Buffett and says, here's the list, I got it. And he says, all right, good. I want you to circle the top 5. I want you to focus on the 5 priorities that are most important to you. Go ahead and circle those, take a little bit of time. Goes off and does that, brings the list back. And he's like, okay, tell me how you're gonna deal with this now, Mike. What are you gonna do? He says, well, I've selected my top 5 most important priorities, so I'm gonna go ahead and focus on those, and then the rest of this list will be kind of like my backup plan, right? On weekends, or when I have extra time, or when a project stalls, I'll work on the other stuff. And Buffett said, no, you got it all wrong. This list of numbers 6 through 25 is your never do under any circumstance list. And the reason, it took me a while to grasp why this is so important. The things that we love that are not the most important are the easiest to rationalize spending time on and distracting us from the things that are really important, right? The things that are good but not great, that's the stuff that ends up taking us off course. It's not that we don't really want something. It's not that we don't really, want to improve, or we don't know exactly what the most important thing is to us. It's that we choose to spend our ways on numbers 6 through 25 too often. We choose to make these rationalizations for, this is a decent use of time. I'm not really wasting time, right? I'm not sitting around watching a bad TV show or something. I'm working on something relatively important. But that's the stuff that pulls away from greatness. So what I like to think about, come back to that rose bush. I'm not much of a gardener, but gardeners tell me that if you want a rose bush to blossom, to fully bloom, to become the most they can be, you have to prune away buds, right? You can't just let everything grow unpruned. And in order to do that, that means you have to cut away buds that could blossom into something. They could become a full-grown flower. They could look good. So these are good ideas that you have to clip away, but you have to prune those out of your life if you want to truly be great, if you want to focus on flourishing to the biggest degree. So pruning away these ideas and using Buffett's strategy of this 25-5 rule is one way to cut out the things that are in your life that are distracting you from greatness. Another way, and this is on a daily basis, so you can think of Buffett's as like a longer timeline, as like a strategy, and then this Eisenhower box is how do I run my day-to-day activities. So if you want, I put together a Google Doc where you can like download either a PDF version or just use an online version of the Eisenhower box. You can download that at jamesclear.com/ebox if you want a copy of it. But you can also just write it on your paper. The basic idea, President Eisenhower used this daily, supposedly, when he was running the United States and throughout his illustrious career as a military official. You have 4 different boxes, right? You have important and urgent. These are the things, this is the do category, stuff you need to get done right today. It's always important and it needs to be done, it's on fire. The next category is not urgent, but it is important. This is the category that we often overlook. These are the things I know I should be doing. I know they're good habits. I know I should be going to the gym more often, but I just can't seem to make time for it. This is the stuff that you need to decide when to do it. You need to schedule it at some point. The next is not important, but urgent. This is the stuff that pulls us away a lot of the time. These are the fires, the daily emergencies, the things that pop up, right? I need to go pick my kids up from school. Somebody got sick. I have to take them to the hospital. There's all sorts of things that are like urgent, but not necessarily the most important way to be spending your time and energy. Then there are things that are not important and not urgent. These should just be deleted, right? But a lot of the time we have 1 or 2 of these that have somehow crept in and we're still spending our time on it because inertia and momentum, and we just happen to keep doing that, but we shouldn't be. So this little box can be a useful way to think about where am I spending my time today, and is that in the right category? So the key idea here is that busy does not equal important, and urgent is not the same thing as necessary. Just because something is urgent doesn't mean it needs to get done. So filter out the fluff, focus on what matters. In order to do this, so you may be thinking at this point, all right, I want to focus on the most important stuff, but I still have a lot of priorities. I still have a lot of stuff that sounds important to me. I still would like to build all these new habits. How do I decide what to stick to first? In this case, I would suggest keystone habits. A keystone habit is a type of behavior that you perform that filters into your life in many other ways. I'll give you a couple examples. So one keystone habit for me is working out. If I go to the gym every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, all sorts of things happen. First, I get the benefits of strength training. So yes, that's good. That's what most people think you're going there for. But when I come back, I have an hour of solid focus, right? I get kind of that post-workout high where you have really clear thinking. So my focus is improved. I tend to eat better when I work out. I don't know why, I just don't want to waste it, I guess. I could eat ice cream if I wanted, but I just kind of feel like I have a good streak going, so might as well continue eating well too. Nutrition improves. I sleep better that night because I'm tired and I've worked my body hard. I wake up the next day and I have better energy because I slept well. So at no point was I trying to build better focus habits, nutrition habits, energy habits, sleep habits, but all of those things came as a consequence of this one keystone habit. So if you're looking for a way to get started in a very practical way, think about what the keystone habit could be for you. Some popular examples, weightlifting's mine. Meditation is another one that you commonly hear CEOs talk about. If I get my daily meditation habit in, then everything is much easier for me. Walking, going on a daily walk is a very common one, especially for artists if they need some creative time. If they do their daily walk each day, the rest of it kind of flows. Visualization is a common one. You'll hear comedians say things like, I rehearse the greatest performance I've had right before I step out onto stage, or I visualize having a successful speech right before I step onto the stage. So those type of visualization techniques can be useful as well. But think about what you do on days when you perform at your best. That'll give you an insight into what your keystone habit could be. All right, part 3, how do I take action? One way is pre-commitment. Pre-commitment is a strategy basically for overcoming this idea that our willpower fades. Our willpower, is not always useful or not always at its peak. So pre-commitment is what I would call an instant willpower improvement. And we've talked about how you can be paralyzed by choice, this kind of lion in the chair philosophy. And when our willpower is low, we're less likely to give up choices, right? We don't have the option to, we don't have the power, the strength, the attention, the energy to make the right choice. So we say, I'd rather just not make a choice right now. So we can use pre-commitment to overcome this. Let me give you an example. So there was a study done. They looked at this large organization. They had thousands of employees, and they sent out a random sample. They said, our goal is to get more employees to take their flu vaccination each year. How are we going to do this? How are we going to change their behavior? So they sent out a couple different options. Option 1 just said, hey, guess what? You need to go get a flu shot. Option 2 went out to a couple employees that said, you need to get a flu shot, and we would like you to select a date for when you do that, right? And so if they just selected a date and said, I'm gonna do it on April 22nd, then they were 2.4 times more likely to end up getting it because they pre-committed to a certain time. They were 4 times more likely, however, if they got the third option, which is to say, I will do it on this day at this time. So by pre-committing to a particular behavior, they drastically improved the odds they were going to perform that behavior. Then there's another option, okay? So they sent out another one and it said, not only do you need to get a flu shot, we've chosen the time and date for you. So you're gonna go there on April 22nd at 1 p.m. and if you need to change it, you can call this number. By pre-committing to people to something that they had no role in, they still increased behavior by 12%. Now, there are all sorts of ways that we can use this in our lives. If you want to use pre-commitment, what I would suggest is implementation intentions. This is a popular study that I enjoy citing. So you can actually increase your odds of performing a particular behavior by 2 to 3%, double or triple the odds that you're going to do something just by using what's called an implementation intention. There are hundreds of studies on implementation intentions if you feel like seeing more, but we'll talk about this one. What they did was researchers brought in a group and they have 3 different cohorts. First cohort, they said, we want you to track how often you work out over the next 2 weeks. The second group, they said, we also want you to track how often you work out, but we're gonna show you this motivational presentation, this motivational talk and pamphlets and video on the benefits of exercise. So here's the cardiovascular benefits, this is why you should do it. So group 2 was the motivated group. Group 3, they said, we also want you to track how often you exercise, and they gave them the same motivational presentation, so they're equally motivated as group 2. And they had them do one other thing, and that one thing was fill out this sentence. During the next week, I will partake in at least 20 minutes of vigorous exercise on this day, at this time, at this place. So they had to state their intention to perform the behavior and be very specific about it. Here's what happened. So group 1, the control group, 38% of them worked out over the next 2 weeks. Group 2, the motivation group, 0 impact. Motivation faded as soon as they left the building. 1 out of 3 ended up working out. Group 3, 91% of them followed through. The only difference was they stated when and where they were gonna perform the behavior. So if you're looking to build a new habit, be very clear about carving out space in your life and when that habit is gonna occur. So key idea, pick a date, choose a place, give your goals a time and a space to live. All right, if you're willing to follow this so far, if you're on board with this, then you may be thinking, how do I get to the next level, right? How do I escalate and improve from here? How do I maintain consistency over the long term, right? Anybody can make these 1% changes once or twice. Anybody can have a good day, but how do you show up consistently time after time? Here's one example, and this is gonna lead us into what I think is the most powerful way to change behavior, which is environment design. So the story here is about a guy named Trent Dursmid, and Trent was a young banker in his early 20s, 23, 24, in Abbotsford, Canada. And this was in the 90s. Abbotsford was still a small suburb of Vancouver, not a whole lot of banking deals coming through there. And he was tasked with being a young salesman, a young broker, and this is the strategy that he followed. He had one simple habit. Every morning, I would start with 120 paper clips in one jar, and I would keep dialing the phone until I'd move them all to a second jar. So you had a couple of 120 paper clips, make a sales call, move one over. Repeat 120 times. And he did that every single day, and over the first 2 years, he grew his book from 0 to $5 million in business. He ended up making $75,000 the first year. A couple years later, he negotiated that into a $200,000 job, still in his mid-20s. And this is all he did. He's like, I didn't check analyst reports, I didn't check stock reports, I didn't check the weather, I didn't look at how the business and technology scene was doing, I just made calls. And for every behavior that we're gonna perform, whether you wanna be a better athlete, a better musician, a better business person, there is some core fundamental task that drives results. And if you do that task and you do it 120 times a day, every day, you're gonna get a lot of results. So think about what that is for you and what that core behavior is that actually drives things, rather than getting caught up in, have I done enough research? Have I looked at the next analyst report? Have I learned the latest marketing strategy? Instead, think about what is the behavior that actually drives this performance. So, another
I like talking about building good habits and breaking bad ones, kind of improving your performance, improving the trajectory that you're on, figuring out small changes, reasonable changes that you can make that can lead you to more success or to the desired result that you're trying to achieve. And to do that, I like to dive into different stories. So I want to share a couple stories from Atomic Habits and from the work that I've been doing that maybe you all can take with you and kind of walk out of here and have a few things that you can remember and think about. My hope is that this presentation will be very practical, really actionable, and you can walk out of here and be like, you know what, I have a set of tools that I can use for building good habits and breaking bad ones. And my view is that there is no like one way to do this. You know, there's no one way to build a successful real estate business. There's no one way to build a better habit. There are a set of tools, and my job is to lay the tools out on the table. And your job is to say, you know what, I think for my style or for my situation, I need a wrench, or I need a hammer, or I need a screwdriver. So let me go ahead and dive into some of those. You know, some of you may be familiar with the book already, and one of the stories I kicked the book off with is the story of the British cycling team. For many years, British cycling is very mediocre. They have very modest performance on the world stage. You know, like imagine the most mediocre person that you work with. They're here, don't look at them. It's just, he's right there. It's like some nervous laughter. Me? For many years, British cycling was that person, you know, and they wanted to change this. They wanted to perform at a higher level. And so they hired this guy named Dave Brailsford, this performance director. And he came in and he had one concept, one idea that made him a little bit different than the coaches that had come before. And he referred to that concept as the aggregation of marginal gains. The aggregation of marginal gains. And just like we were talking about a minute ago with the plane shifting a few degrees, this idea of accumulating small improvements, of making slight changes to your trajectory, and how far that can take you in the long run, that was kind of at the core of his philosophy. And so the way that he phrased it was, listen, let's try to make all these little 1% improvements in nearly everything that we do related to cycling. So they started with a bunch of things that you would expect a cycling team to focus on. Like they put slightly lighter tires on the bike, they designed a more ergonomic seat, they asked each rider to wear a little chip, like a little feedback sensor, to see how the individual would respond to training and practice, and then they would adjust the workouts based on that data and feedback. But cycling is a competitive sport, and there are a lot of teams that are doing things like that. So then they started to make these little 1% improvements, these small adjustments related to cycling that nobody else was really thinking about too much, or they weren't giving that much attention to. So for example, they hired a surgeon to come in and teach the riders how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of catching a cold or getting the flu. They have two different types of fabrics. They have indoor racing suits and outdoor racing suits, and they tested those fabrics in a wind tunnel, and they found out that the indoor fabric was lighter and more aerodynamic. So they asked all of their riders to wear that suit when they raced. They have a large trailer, a big like semi-truck that carries a lot of the bikes in it to major events. And they stack the bikes up in there and they would paint the walls and the floor and the ceiling white so that they could better spot little bits of dirt and dust that might get in the gears and degrade the performance of the bikes. They even had each rider try like a dozen different types of pillows to see which one led to the best night's sleep for each person. And then once they figured that out, they would bring that pillow on the road with them to hotels for the Tour de France and other major races. So Brailsford said, you know, if we can actually do this, right, if we can make all these little 1% improvements related to cycling, then I think we can win a Tour de France in 5 years. Now, they had never won for over 110 years, and he ended up being wrong. They won in 3 years, and then they repeated again the fourth year with a different rider, and then after a 1 year break, they won the next 3 in a row. So after having never won for over 100 years, suddenly they win 5 out of the next 6. But it was really at the Olympics in London in 2012 when this strategy kind of fully blossomed, because, you know, the Tour de France, there's a team element to it, but ultimately one person wins the race. But at the Olympic Games, you have men's team, women's team, dozens of riders, dozens of events, and the British cycling team won 70% of the gold medals available in London. Rio, 4 years later, same story, 60% of the gold medals go to the British team. So this idea that 1% improvements are not just like nice to have, you know, they're not just a bonus or a cherry on top of your performance or some little extra, but that they actually can be a pathway to unlocking elite levels of success, exceptional levels of performance. Think it's a little surprising, a little counterintuitive, certainly underappreciated. So what I'm really getting at here, what we're really saying is that excellence is often not about radical change, it's about accruing small improvements over time. And this is a fairly straightforward idea, right? Many of you have probably heard something kind of like this: get a little better each day, Kaizen, baby steps, like that kind of thing. But even though the concept of continuous improvement is fairly straightforward, most people don't take it seriously. And if you do take it seriously, if you do wake up each day and try to actually find some small margin of improvement, if you do show up each morning and actually try to find some way to get 1% better, some little advantage to carve out, man, you'd be surprised what that can turn into in the long run. I like to visualize this in a couple different ways. So this chart's one way to visualize it, right? And what this is saying, what this is showing, is if you get 1% better each day for a year, so 1.01 to the 365th power, you get 37 times better by the end of the year. If you get 1% worse, 0.99 to the 365th power, you drive yourself almost all the way down to zero. Now, this chart, this graph, this is just compound interest, right? It's just like a compounding curve. And real life is not exactly like compound interest. Your habits are not exactly like a mathematical formula. But man, I feel like charts like this do a good job of encapsulating what the process of behavior change feels like as you're showing up and trying to get a little bit better each day. Imagine you're at the beginning of this curve, right? You're at day one. So what is the difference between a choice that's 1% better or 1% worse? On any given day, not a whole lot. Those lines are really close together in the beginning. What's the difference between eating a burger and fries for lunch or eating a salad? Today, like nothing. Your body looks the same in the mirror at the end of the night. The scale hasn't really changed. It's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that you're like, oh, those choices do add up. Or like knowledge, same story. The person who spends 10 minutes each day reading a book or learning something new. Look, reading for 10 minutes a day does not make you a genius. But over 10 or 20 or 30 years, the person who always goes to bed a little bit smarter than they were when they woke up, the person who always finds time to learn something new, that can be a pretty meaningful difference in wisdom and insight. And so you see this again and again. What starts out small and is relatively insignificant, pretty easy to dismiss on any given day, it transforms, it multiplies, it compounds, becomes something much greater over time. And so for all of those reasons, I like to refer to habits as the compound interest of self-improvement. The same way that money multiplies through compound interest, the effects of your habits multiply as you repeat them across time. Time will magnify whatever you feed it. So if you have good habits, time becomes your ally. And every day that goes by, you put yourself in a better position. But if you have bad habits, time becomes your enemy. And every day that goes by, you kind of dig the hole a little bit deeper. And so what I'm really getting across here, what I'm really trying to emphasize, this kind of first big idea of today, is an emphasis on trajectory rather than position. There's so much discussion about position in life. We've all these metrics, all these measurements for analyzing our current position. What's the number on the scale? How much money's in the bank account? What's the current stock price? What are the quarterly earnings? We have all these ways of analyzing our current position. And then usually there's some kind of like guilt or judgment or analysis that comes out of that. Oh, I'm not where I wanted to be, or we haven't achieved what we said we wanted to achieve. And what I'm encouraging is to say, listen, just for a minute, let's stop worrying so much about our current position and focus a little bit more on our current trajectory.